Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers. Season 2, Episode 7, the one where God exists. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. Before I start this week's episode, I wonder if there is anyone listening who has thought about starting their own podcast. Maybe you've just thought about it right now, just as I said that sentence. Well, I could not have started the RE podcast without Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout makes starting a podcast really easy. You can even do it for free for the first 3 months to take out the risk factor. It tells you everything you have to do to start one up and will host it for you. It gives you all your statistics, how many people are listening, on what platform, where in the world. It also gives you tips on how to improve your podcast. For a newbie podcaster like me, and for someone who isn't really tech savvy, Buzzsprout made the RE podcast happen. I've put a link in the show notes, and it'd be really great if you could use it if you want to explore how to start your own podcast. I wonder, what would you do a podcast on? Anyway, back to the episode. There will be people listening to this podcast who believe in God. Put your hands up. And there will be people listening to this podcast who do not believe in God. Give me a high five. And there are people listening to this podcast who have no idea whether or not God exists. Mexican wave. And then there are those who just don't care. If you believe in God, you are called a theist. If you don't believe in God, you are called an atheist. A means not in Greek. If you are not sure, then you are called an agnostic. A meaning not, and Gnosticism based on the Greek word for knowledge. I wonder if any of you could take a guess what percentage of the world's population are atheist. That is, that don't believe in God. Take a guess. Shout it out. Would it surprise you that it is only about 7%? And globally, about 70% of people believe in God. Even in communist countries like China, where belief in God is discouraged, or in Japan, where the main religions have no God, Shintoism and Buddhism, more than 50% of their population still believe in God. I live in the UK, and while church attendance is decreasing, only about 25% of people are atheists. So why do so many people believe in God? And is there any evidence for this belief? What is noticeable is that belief in God occurs in every age, every gender, every class, and every race. So doctors, teachers, scientists, shop assistants, refuse collectors, flight attendants, those not in employment, lawyers, old, young, black, white, Asian, all believe in God. To start with, let's be clear. There is no empirical evidence for or against the existence of God. Now, I know it's been a while since I've thrown in a big word and I've lulled you into a false sense of security, but empirical means evidence that you can see, that you can test, that you can prove through your senses, scientific evidence. This means if you believe in God, you do so by faith. But if you don't believe in God, you also believe this through faith. There is no empirical proof that God exists, and there is no empirical proof that God does not exist. But each side has reasons for their belief that proves it to them. This means that the only truly empirical conclusion you can come to is agnosticism. As I said, agnostic is based on the Greek words for not and knowledge, so not knowing. It was first used by T.H. Huxley in 1869, but he didn't actually say it means that you don't know whether God exists or not, but simply that it is not possible to know because there's no proof either way. And yes, T.H. Huxley was related to Aldous Huxley of Brave New World fame. Aldous was T.H. Huxley's grandson. What a family. Now, I could get really technical here and talk about atheistic agnosticism, where you don't know whether God exists, but you think he probably doesn't. Or agnostic theism, where you don't know whether or not God exists, but you think he might, as that might confuse you. But there is a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 means you 100% believe in God, and 7 means you 100% don't believe in God. It's a bit like the Kinsey scale, but for belief in God rather than sexual preference. I've already done an episode on the problem of evil, but I will summarise what I said because this is the main reason that people do not believe in God. Simply, if God is meant to be all-powerful and all-loving, then why does he allow so much pain and suffering? If he was all-loving, he would want to stop suffering. If he was all-powerful, then he would be able to stop suffering. And yet, evil and suffering exist. So clearly, God is either not all-loving and doesn't want to stop it, or he's not all-powerful and he can't stop it, or he does not exist. Since without omnibenevolence and omnipotence he's not God, the only conclusion is that God does not exist. Theists argue that there are reasons why God allows suffering. Their main reason being, this is the only way that God could allow us to have free will. Suffering is caused by humans choosing to do wrong actions. The only way to prevent this is to take away free will. But they also argue that God has dealt with evil and suffering by sending Jesus to die for us so we can go to heaven and live in a perfect paradise with no more pain and no more suffering. Then Jesus rose from the dead, defeating evil and death. And God is now waiting for as many people as possible to become Christians before that perfect reality is realized. There are obvious flaws in these theodicies. Theos, Greek word for God, dike, Greek word for justice, so theodicy is justifying God's allowance of evil. But would we really want to live in a world with no choice, with no pain, with no competition, with no death, with no variety, with no contrast? The other reason people don't believe in God is that there's no evidence for God. There are lots of things to say about this. First of all, that there isn't proof of no God either, and yet atheists ignore that. Also, if there was proof of God, we would have no choice but to believe in him. Now, a warning, I am going to get into some deep philosophy now. If God was too far from our reach, we would never be able to find him. If he was too close, we would have no choice but to believe in him. So it is argued that God is close enough to find, but not close enough to affect our freedom. This is called, arm yourself, epistemic distance. The perfect distance to be able to find him without affecting our freedom. It also says in the Bible that there is clear proof of God. Now, one of the books in the Bible is called Romans. It was written by Paul, a guy who used to be called Saul, and he would arrest Christians and have them killed, but then he converted to Christianity, so he had to change his name so people wouldn't recognize him and associate him with his previous job. Paul wrote letters to the early Christians to tell them how to live. Some of the Romans had converted to Christianity too, but bought things from the Roman religion. Paul had to clarify things. Anyway, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he wrote this: "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Essentially, the universe is evidence that God exists. Let's break this down. There are two famous arguments for the existence of God based on this idea: the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. Sounds blooming complicated, right? Let me break it down for you. If you listen to the episode on creation, you will already be familiar with the cosmological argument. Cosmology is the study of the universe, so any arguments that try to explain the cause of the universe as God are called cosmological arguments. St. Thomas Aquinas thought that the universe is proof that God exists. His basic argument is that the universe needs a cause, and God is the only thing that is able to be the cause of the universe. And why did he think this, you ask? First of all, because the cause of the universe has to be outside time, because it had to have started time. You can't start time unless you existed before time. And if you exist before time, you must be an eternal being. If this is messing with your head a little bit, then do this little experiment. Take any oblong object like a phone or a pen or a ruler or a TV remote. Hold it in one hand out in front of you. With your empty hand, point to one end of the object. That there is the beginning of time. Point to the other end. That there is the end of time. God is where you are currently standing, outside of time, so has no beginning and no end. I know this blows our tiny little minds, but stay with me. So God is infinite and caused time to exist. God is also all-powerful, a very helpful quality if you're going to create a universe. So God does seem to have some of the necessary qualities with which to create the universe. And ta-da! Aquinas suggests that God exists because he is the one that caused the universe. But alongside this is a second argument called the teleological argument. It is also known as the design argument. It says that not only does stuff exist, but that stuff works, and it has a purpose. Teleos means purpose, hence the complicated name teleological argument. But not only that, it also looks good. So, there isn't just a cause of the universe, which could be anything. There is a designer, and not just any designer, but an intelligent one. Let's break it down. This argument is usually associated with a dude called William Paley. He said that if you are walking in the countryside and you saw a stone, you would not think much about it. You would not consider who'd made it or where it came from. However, if you saw a watch, it would stand out to you. It would look nice. It would have intricate parts that all work together with the purpose of telling the time. You would make the assumption that someone had designed that watch for a purpose, not that it had just appeared there one day randomly. If there is a watch, then there must be a watchmaker. He said this analogy was like the universe. It looks beautiful, and it is intricate, and things work together to sustain life. If the Earth was 1 millimeter closer to the sun, it would be too hot to sustain life. If it was 1 millimeter further away, it would be too cold. The Earth is the exact distance from the sun to sustain life. And not only that, it is perfectly positioned so that when the moon gets in between the Earth and the sun, we get a perfect solar eclipse. Everything on the planet is perfectly balanced. Gravity, the chemical formula of the air, the chances that conditions would be right for human life is about 1 in 700 quadrillion. That is a 7 with 20 zeros. But not only that, but sunsets, newborn babies' skin, kittens are all beautiful too. Now, I know what you are saying. What about all the stuff that doesn't work or is ugly, like cancer and tsunamis? Well, even if a watch is broken, you still know there is a watchmaker. So even if the world isn't perfect, Paley thinks there is still a designer. And yes, I can hear you shouting evolution at me. That things did not get designed to be like this, they evolved to be like this. If conditions had been different, life could still have evolved, just a different life. And those living things could also come to the conclusion that they were designed by an intelligent designer. Right, now I'm getting out the big guns, the ontological argument. Now it's hard to know if this is the most ridiculous argument for the existence of God ever, or whether there's something about it that makes total sense. First of all, I want you to imagine your perfect boy or girlfriend. Like, really imagine them. What would they look like? What would they be like? How would they make you feel? What would your relationship be like? Now, I'm going to give you a choice. Either you could spend the rest of your life continuing to imagine that person, or you could actually meet them exactly as you imagined in real life. Which one would you prefer? The one who is imaginary, or the one that actually exists? Let me put it another way. Would you rather have the idea of £1 million or actually have £1 million? Would you rather have the idea of your perfect holiday or actually go on your perfect holiday? Essentially, what I'm suggesting is that existence is better than non-existence. You would much rather have £1 million than just imagine it. Still not convinced? Who would win in a fight if a real person had a fight with an imaginary person? Who would win a game, a real person or an imaginary person? So, if existence is greater than non-existence, then a God who exists is greater than a God who does not exist. The definition of God is a being that is all-powerful, the greatest of all things, that than which nothing greater can be thought. So therefore, God must exist. Let me summarize. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Existence is greater than non-existence. Therefore, God must exist. You may argue that God is not that than which nothing greater can be thought. But if you can conceive of something greater than God, then that thing is God. A triangle is a shape with three sides by definition. God is the greatest conceivable thing by definition. If you want to be really poncy, it's called a tautology. Two ways of saying the same thing. A triangle or a shape with three sides. God or the greatest conceivable thing. What's interesting is that the main person who criticised this argument was a monk. And he already believed in God. He just thought it was a ridiculous way to prove it. His name was Gornillo, and he said, "If I could conceive of a perfect island, that island doesn't have to exist." The poor guy who came up with the ontological argument, Anselm, got a bit huffy at this point and said, "We are not talking about a perfect island, but the greatest conceivable thing of all." Gornillo remains unconvinced. So, is there other evidence for the existence of God that does not involve complicated philosophy that makes our heads hurt? But what about religious experience, or miracles, or answered prayer? Many people that believe in God say that their belief is based on personal experience and proof of God. So let's explore that. A while ago, I watched a documentary on prayer that had several control groups who were ill. One group was being prayed for, but they weren't told they were. One group was being prayed for, and they were told they were. One group wasn't being prayed for, but were told that they were. One group wasn't being prayed for, and was told that they weren't being prayed for. The upshot was pretty inconclusive on whether prayer works, as some people in each group got better and some didn't. The only thing which it showed is that if you are told you are being prayed for, whether or not you actually are, there is a marginal improvement in your health. This does not necessarily prove that prayer works, but does prove the placebo effect. That if you believe in something, it has a positive effect on you, whether or not it is actually true. Almost as though positive thinking helps your physical body heal. There is actually a lot of evidence for this. It's called psychosomatic healing. Also, in moments of stress or angst or fear, it has positive effects if you are able to talk to someone. And it is so good for your mental health to be daily thankful for things. So I'm all for prayer. Not because I think necessarily God answers prayer, but I do see it as positive. So let's take miracles. Anyone who has experienced a miracle firsthand will have personal evidence for God. But it is not empirical because you cannot repeat the miracle and get the same results over and over again. And that is the problem with miracles. Even if they do happen, why does God heal some people and not others? If God is powerful and loving enough to end some people's suffering, why does God discriminate? Also, many miracles could be explained as beneficial experiences. For example, you are about to drown and you pray for help and then a boat comes along. You don't know whether the boat would have come along even if you hadn't prayed. I think the topic of miracles is a deep one, both defining them, looking at examples, and then finding alternative explanations. So I will note that as a further episode. Many people have felt the presence of God or heard the voice of God. There is no way to verify this, and the problem is that people say contradicting things about what God has told them. George Bush Jr. famously said that God told him to invade Iraq, but yet Osama bin Laden believes that he was doing the work of God. And that's the problem with miracles, answered prayers, and religious experiences, that all religions use them to claim that their religion is the correct one. So either they are all talking to the same God, or they cancel each other out. In the recent presidential elections, many Christians claimed that God had assured them that Trump would get a second term, and it never happened. So it is possible that people think they have heard from God when actually they haven't. As always, if the belief you have brings a positive outcome for you and for those around you, then I don't think you need to prove it. But if you remember Pascal's wager from a previous episode, if you don't believe in God, then you have the worst odds, as if you're wrong, there could be dire consequences. I'd be really interested to know your beliefs about God, so go to @TheRePodcast1 on Twitter and look out for the poll. Alternatively, say hi on my Instagram, The RE Podcast, or sign up on my website, www.therepodcast.co.uk, to be the first to know about new episodes and to receive extra content from interviews. Listen to post-interview chats with all my guests. And remember Buzzsprout to start your own podcast. And Teacher Hug Radio, the soundtrack to your teaching career, available on Alexa or on the website www.teacherhugradio.co.uk. And if there is anyone listening who studies A-Level RE or is thinking about doing it, can I recommend a brilliant podcast with Sarah Fletcher called the RE A-Level Podcast, available on all your usual podcast providers. As always, I'll put links to everything in the show. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. I just proved it to you. But thank you so much for listening to me bore the life out of you.